when at approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon, the parachute on the radio had failed to open. The world had been immediately reduced to a 2.5-mile gulch, and of this small, steep world, 60 acres have been occupied by fire. Now, a little less than 2 hours later, the world was drastically reduced from that to the 150 yards between the Smokejumpers and the fire that in minutes would catch up to them, to the roar below them that was all there was left of the bottom of the gulch, and to the head of the gulch that at that moment was smoke about to roar. Somewhere beyond thought, however, there was an outside world with some good men in it. There were a lot more men sitting in bars who were out of drinking money and also out of shape and had never been on a fire before. They found themselves on this one. There are also times, especially as the world is blowing up, when even good men land at the mouth of the wrong gulch, forget to bring litters even though they are a rescue team, and after having gone back to get some blankets, show up with only one for all those who would be cold that night from burns and suffering. One good man from the outside had come close to the inside. At about 5 o'clock, roughly about the time the crew had tooled up and started from the head of the gulch toward the fire, one good man had started up Man Gulch from the river. He had seen the fire blow up around him, then had been trapped by it and lost consciousness while running through a whirl that had jumped to the north side of the gulch. So about the time that Dodge and his crew were hurrying down gulch into the blow-up, Ranger Robert Jansen at the lower end was running from the blow-up back to the river. Jansen was ranger of the Helena National Forest Canyon Ferry District, its station located then on the Missouri River about 23 miles northeast of Helena. With roads now nearly everywhere, planes and helicopters overhead, and word spread almost instantly by telephone or radio, it has become much easier and quicker to get men on fires, and as a result, many Forest Service districts have merged and disappeared. Today, Canyon Ferry District and the Helena District are one, but in 1949, the Canyon Ferry District alone was a big piece of country, somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 acres, and extending far enough downriver to include Man Gulch. Man Gulch at the time of the fire was the responsibility of a dedicated ranger, not easy to work for, and like others who came close to this fire and survived, he was never to escape it. As a ranger, he had always been obsessive in his dedication. As often as he could, he walked on mountains, watching and working and expecting his men to do the same. When, for instance, he should have kept only a skeleton crew on the 4th of July and let the rest of his crew go to town, he kept all his men at work chasing fires he had faked, and he was a Methodist and did not drink or smoke. Unlike most rangers, he was a sensitive, vivid writer, and both his official position and the things in him that saw and felt compelled him to write report after report on the Man Gulch fire, two of which should be listed in the literature of forest fires, if there is such a listing and such a literature. His reports are in official prose and depend upon reporting and not prose, and so have to be exceptionally good reporting to be good. Jansen starts fitting together when we come to understand his love of his district, his sense that it was his protectorate, and his constant fear that it was about to blow up or already had and he didn't know where. He was constantly in the field, even when the district would have been better off if he had been in the ranger station. But he knew his district inch by inch, and he had made a fire plan for every gulch and every possible blow-up, and he worked his men illegal hours and holidays so that the blow-up would be averted or at least spotted immediately. He makes us think of ourselves as we would be if we were made responsible for 250,000 or 300,000 acres or some of the roughest country anywhere on the Missouri River, and knew that when the fire blew, our help would be mostly bums picked up at bars and college students on summer vacation. We would be trying to do everything ourselves all at once, all the time, and trying to get everybody else to do the same. And we would have been, as he was, chronically ill, telling his close friends that it was hereditary, but never saying what it was. There was a big streak in him of those old-time rangers who had 1910 on the brain. Rangers for decades after were on the watch for fear that 1910 might start again, and right in their woodpile. Some even lost their jobs because the fire got away from them. So Jansen was part of old-time ranger, part us, part John Robert Jansen. In fact, he had been one of the first to spot and report the Man Gulch fire. About 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, August 4th, a lightning storm had passed over Helena and the gates of the mountains while Jansen was in Helena attending a meeting with several other rangers in the office of Supervisor Moore. Lightning was heavy, and immediately 8 fires were reported, 4 in Jansen's Canyon Ferry district. The rangers hurried off to get on their fires. Jansen spent the rest of that afternoon and the evening taking suppressive action on 3 lightning fires and 1 camper fire. In addition to fires that appear almost immediately after a lightning storm, there are usually a few sleepers that take a day or more before they can be spotted. Fires often caused by lightning striking a dead tree with only rocks and a few dead needles underneath, so that only after a time do enough ashes fall to get a ground fire started with smoke showing. Accordingly, Jansen and his supervisor agreed that Jansen should wait until 11 the next morning before making an air patrol in order to give the dew time to dry and the sleepers to awake. On August 4th, the day the lightning storm blew by, fire conditions were not critical. On August 5th, they were. At Canyon Ferry Ranger Station, the fire danger rating was 16 out of a possible 100 on August 4th, but on the next day, it was 74 out of 100. When questioned as to how such a rating should be classified, Jansen answered, explosive stage. Jansen had tried to reach Jim Harrison, the guard at Meriwether Station, on the evening of August 4th by radio, but atmospheric conditions were bad, and it was the next morning before he made contact. Harrison told him that there had been many lightning strikes north, downriver in the direction of Man Gulch, the afternoon before, but Jansen told him he should clean up the picnic grounds first and not start on patrol until 11 o'clock, so he would miss no late sleepers. The next morning, at 11 o'clock, Jansen flew from Helena down the Missouri to within a mile west of where the Man Gulch fire was to appear, and on the way back flew directly over the spot, but he returned to Helena having seen only one small smoke coming from a sleeper reported earlier in the morning. He even flew low over Harrison's patrol station, hoping to get a signal from him. But Harrison by now had probably spotted the fire and was on his way back to his Meriwether camp, where after unsuccessfully trying to radio Canyon Ferry Ranger Station, he tacked his last message on the door. He and his mother did not know it, but he was on his way to rejoin the Jumpers, and they were on the way to all that she feared. Although nothing new had shown up from the air, the moment Jansen's plane landed at Helena, smoke rose from the Missouri, but seemingly farther downriver than they had flown. When Jansen reported this new smoke to the supervisor's office, he was told that the lookout on Colorado Mountain had just reported a fire in Man Gulch, but Jansen did not take this location as gospel, since Colorado Mountain was about 30 miles from Man Gulch. Not being sure that this new fire was even on Forest Service land, he decided to fly the gates of the mountains once more. Now smoke could be seen from the river as his plane approached Man Gulch. Fire was burning on the ridge between Man Gulch and Meriwether, but at that time entirely on the Man Gulch side and seemingly not spreading except at its up-gulch edge. He estimated to be 8 acres in extent, 6 acres by a later survey. When asked at the review whether it was an exceptional experience for a fire to be 8 acres an hour after a ranger had not been able to see it, Jansen answered, "In my judgment, that was unusual." While still observing the Man Gulch fire from the air, Jansen had spotted another fire to the south, which was to be called the York Fire. York is on Trout Creek, which has a number of summer and even permanent homes on it, so the damage a fire in that location could do is considerably greater than what one in Man Gulch could do. In fact, there were times during the coming day and night when it looked as if the best men and equipment should be sent to the Trout Creek. In addition, the first sleeper found that morning was now starting to smoke up. Maybe men and equipment should be sent to it. Evidently, it was going to be one of those days when one of the biggest problems in facing danger was to figure out the biggest danger, but not to have a change of mind too often or too late or too soon. It is hard to know what to do with all the detail that rises out of a fire. It rises out of a fire as thick as smoke and threatening to blot out everything. Some of it's true, but doesn't make any difference. Some of it's just plain wrong. Some doesn't even exist except in your mind, as you slowly discover long afterwards. Some of it, though, is true and makes all the difference. The first half of the art of firefighting is learning to recognize a real piece of fire when you see one, and not letting your supervisor talk you out of it. Some fires are more this way than others and are good practice for real life. On the return of Jansen's plane to Helena, cloud formations were noted, which the pilot said meant high and variable winds. Forest fires need high and variable winds and can make their own updrafts once they get started. The clouds were cumulus clouds, white, uneven, and puffy, caused by updrafts from variable heat conditions on the ground. In this story about smoke jumpers, clouds and winds are to be closely observed, even to the end, and even if no one can tell for sure what details are going to make a difference. By the time they landed again in Helena, Jansen had made a tentative man and equipment order for the Man Gulch fire. He ordered 50 men with equipment and overhead, 2 Pacific pumps with 3,000 feet of hose, and 50 sack lunches. Soon he added 25 smoke jumpers to the order because he believed the fire to be in an almost inaccessible area, and the only chances to hold it to a small fire would be to get men on it in another few hours. Supervisor Moore agreed to telephone the fire desk in Missoula, but was told that although enough jumpers were available at the base, all planes except one were on mission, and the one plane, a C-47, could hold only 16 jumpers with equipment. Jansen and Moore said no to sending a second plane later in the afternoon. That would probably be too late to get the jumpers on the fire before dark. This is at 1:44. At 2:30, the one plane left Missoula. In the meantime, Jansen ate lunch in the office while he waited for the 50-man emergency crew to be rounded up, which brings up again the practice the Forest Service used to make of recruiting large crews of volunteer firefighters for emergencies. In those days, the Helena National Forest Service thought it had an agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation and the canyon constructors to send men on call. But as it turned out, it was the Bureau's understanding that the plan was to operate only when its men were off shift. And at the time of the Man Gulch fire, practically none of them were. So when not enough smoke jumpers could be dropped on a threatening fire, and there were other threatening fires to think about, the Forest Service soon would be combing the bars for stool bums, and stool bums, apart from not being much good on a fire, are not easy to get off their stools. Like the rest of us, perhaps more so. They would rather remain alive on a stool exposed to the possibility of being converted by the Salvation Army than be found dead on a fire line with a Pulaski smoldering in their hands. So after a while, when nobody showed up, Jansen and alternate ranger Henry Hersey left the office and started working the bars, ending up with 10, not 50 customers who thought they needed a breath of fresh air. The ones who were still drunk when they got to the fire may well have been better off than the ones who had sobered up and found out where they were. Jansen located a Forest Service horse truck, loaded it with bedrolls, put the 10 recruits on top of the rolls, and at 2:20 started for Hilger Landing, 20 miles from Helena, and nearly another 6 miles by boat from Man Gulch. The owner of an excursion boat had telephoned to report the fire and had said he would hold his boat at Hilger Landing for use of the Forest Service since it was 2:30 when the smoke jumpers left Missoula for Man Gulch. Jansen and his crew were leaving Helena at about the same time, but it would be hours before they located each other. By 3 o'clock, Hersey had collected 9 more revolving bar stools and started for Hilger Landing. Jansen arrived at Hilger Landing only to discover that the owner of the excursion boat had left with a load of paying tourists so they could see firsthand the smoke coming out of the mouth of Man Gulch. The ranger was sore as hell, but as a Methodist interested in working with young people, he says only that he was thoroughly peeved. There wasn't anything he could do, though, but wait. Wow. There was no road through the gates of the mountains in 1949, and because it is designated wilderness, the area still has no roads. Even today, you need a boat to get through the cliffs of the gates. And the boating is fine if you can get a boat, because some 9 miles below the mouth of Man Gulch, there's a big power dam that has made a small lake of the river and backed it up clear to the upper end of the cliffs of the gates, where Jansen was waiting with the crew and no paddle. No wonder he was peeved. He had already worked out his plan with Hersey, and there was nothing constructive he could do while he waited. The plan was for both him and Hersey to land at the mouth of Man Gulch, and then, since it would be getting late in the day, the crew was in poor shape, to set up camp there and wait until the next morning before hitting the fire. Hersey would take charge of the fire crew while Jansen would scout Man Gulch, find the jumpers, bring them back to camp where they could put up a coordinated fight. It was a good plan, except that it did not allow for the wit of the universe and the mental lapses of man. While Jansen waited at Hilger Landing, the recreation guard, Jim Harrison, was alone on the Man Gulch fire. Jansen had to wait 50 minutes with his 10 volunteers before the owner of a private boat, Fred Padbury, a Helena druggist, pulled up to the landing and took on Jansen and his crew and some of their equipment. Soon after, the excursion boat returned to Hilger Landing and started down the river with Hersey, his 9 drunks, and the remaining equipment. Of the total 19, only 3 had ever been on a fire before. 2 were soon to be made straw bosses, an indication of what kind of a crew they were going to be. On the way down the Missouri now, Jansen came to a bend in the river where he could see that the fire had slopped over on the Meriwether side of the ridge. The slop over was already 2 or 3 acres, and the ranger was alarmed. The moment he saw the fire starting down the Meriwether slope, he had to change plans. All would now land at Meriwether, and Hersey would take the crew up the Man Gulch Meriwether Trail to the top of the ridge and contain the fire on the Meriwether side. Then Jansen would continue downstream in the Padbury boat and scout the fire, as originally planned. As usual, this plan left Jansen both the quarterback and the man in motion looking for trouble. And it's hard for even a good man to play 2 positions at once. The excursion boat, being faster than the Padbury boat, passed Jansen and his crew before they reached the Meriwether landing, and Jansen was able to inform Hersey of his change in plans, but because the Padbury boat had to tread water while the big excursion boat docked and unloaded its equipment, Jansen had to wait some more. In the woods, as in the Army, it's often a case of hurry up and wait, and Jansen did not get high marks in waiting. The ranger told Hersey to take all 19 volunteers and get on the fire as soon as possible, stopping only at the guard camp 150 yards up the canyon to radio an order to the supervisor's office. Hersey says he was to tell the office that this was no training fire, to get in gear and give us all the support possible. Specifically, he was to order 2 new crews of 50 men each with experienced overhead, one for Meriwether and one for Man Gulch. He was also to tell Canyon Ferry Ranger Station to try to get in touch with the Smokejumpers by radio to tell them that if they were still in Man Gulch, to come down the Man Gulch Meriwether Ridge to the slop over and join Hersey's 19 men there. Then, before starting up the trail that comes out of Meriwether Canyon like a ladder about to topple backwards, Hersey gave his bar stools a lecture. He told them when they got out to the fire, they should try to hold 2 sides of it, the up-gulch side so that the jumpers could get through and join them, and the side approaching the Meriwether Trail to keep their own escape route open and to save the tourist beauty of Meriwether Canyon. They probably didn't get to the fire till nearly 6 o'clock, Jansen thought. They should have been there sooner. Jansen had left at about 4:35 in the Padbury boat to carry out his plan to scout the fire, and if he found the jumpers, to bring them back to Meriwether. When the boat passed the mouth of Man Gulch, the fire was still on the upper third of Man Gulch's north-facing slope, although heavy smoke was blowing from it across the gulch to the other side. The Padbury boat continued on downstream until it approached the mouth of Elkhorn Creek, a little more than a mile below and to the northwest of Man Gulch. As far away as Elkhorn, the air was feathered with ashes. The Padbury boat then returned upstream to the mouth of Man Gulch, which by now was so full of smoke, Jansen could not see up it. If he wanted to know what was happening there, he would have to walk, and as usual, he was precise with figures. He says he started up the gulch at 5:02. At about that time, Dodge's crew had collected the cargo parachutes after their jump and had something to eat, and then had tooled up and started for the fire. So, at approximately the same time, the fire was being approached from both its upper and its lower ends. Jansen walked up the bottom of Man Gulch for almost half a mile, noting that the fire was picking up momentum, still throwing smoke over his head to the north side of the gulch, where further up Dodge had rejoined his crew and was now leading them toward the river. Then, right behind Jansen at the bottom of the gulch, a spot fire flowered. Then several more flowered just below the main fire. Then a few tossed themselves as bouquets across the gulch, grew rapidly into each other's flames and became a garden of wildfire. What the ranger was about to see was the beginning of the blow-up, seemingly without relation to reality or to the workings of the imagination. The flowers that had grown into a garden distended themselves into an enormous light bulb, with a great mixed metaphor. Flowers and light bulbs don't seem to mix, but the light bulb of the mind strung itself inside with filaments of flame and flowers, bloated and rounded itself at its top with gases, then swirled up gulch to meet the smoke jumpers, trying to escape down gulch. In a few minutes they met, then only a few minutes later the blow-up passed out of the gulch, blew its fuse, and left a world that is still burned out. Jansen was probably the first to walk through a blow-up, propelled by a fire whirl, to drop unconscious in its vortex, to revive only a few feet from its flames, and to live to record it. Afterwards, he would keep returning to Man Gulch with tape and stopwatch to check his original recordings of distances and times, and once he returned with objective observers to check in, he struggled to determine whether what had happened really had measurable boundaries on Earth, but we should already know enough about him to expect that we're about to observe a rare phenomenon of nature through the eyes of an especially fine observer. Jansen was a good enough observer to have been picked in the early years of the serious study of fire behavior by Harry Gisborne as one of a select group of rangers to field test some of the early theories of the Priest River Experiment Station. To Jansen, Gisborne was an idol, as he was to nearly all those who first approached the study of forest fires scientifically, and he is to some of us still living. Later in this story of the Man Gulch fire, it won't be enough to follow along merely as observers of Jansen's observations. There are things we see now that he would not have noticed, and there are things he saw but couldn't explain that we can put together. We know now pretty much what happened because in part it happened in Man Gulch and made its own contribution to the greatly enlarged inventory of our present knowledge of forest fires, and so of our knowledge of many things about the woods. It did not do this immediately, and it was far from the only fatal forest fire that led to the congressional appropriations for the three great national forest fire laboratories, one with its 2 wind tunnels right beside the Smokejumpers base in Missoula. But before the fire labs, there had to be other fatal fires, other parents and communities sharing the same grief, and other newspapers making public records of grief. There also had to come a time when some of the most important members of Congress were from logging states and were members of just the right committee, so it came finally, not in God's time, but in the considerably slower time of bureaucracies, yet it came. Even to me, it's different with me now from when I first started climbing Man Gulch. Now I carry inside me part of the purgation of his tragedy, and is the part of me that the tragedy that knows more about forests and fires because of this forest fire. If now the dead of this fire should awaken and I should be stopped beside the cross, I would no longer be nervous if asked if the first and last question of life, how did it happen? Although it was not until the 1950s that the science of fire behavior became sufficiently advanced to explain blow-ups, it will be helpful to store up here, for later use, what so fine an observer as Jansen saw as he drew near to this tragedy of winds and fire. Jansen noted strange sights as he went up the gulch. For one thing, since he could see for only 200 yards because of the dense smoke, he knew immediately something big was on its way. He could see and hear rocks rolling displaced by the heat. He could see and hear dead snags break off without casual explanation, and he could see and hear that flames were beginning to whirl and roar. At first, these flames just flapped back and forth, signs of unstable air, but the unstable air started to spiral, and the flames began to swirl like little dust devils. Soon, however, they united to become something like a tornado, caused by fire and causing fire, and perfectly named fire whirl. What he refers to as a holocaust is a still later development, one that occurred when these fire whirls were starting other fire whirls that were starting still other fire whirls. Beside him, around him, and in front of him was a vast uproar, trying to break the sound barrier. Behind him, sounds were tapering off and becoming silent as sounds were turning into lights. The world behind him was becoming a circle of lights about to be turned out. Hell may have such illumination preceding such blackness. Fire whirls both intensify existing fire and cause new fires. Their rotating action is that of a giant vortex, and as giants they can reach 2,000 degrees in temperature. Fires that become giants are giant smoke rings with a downdraft in the center, which is full of deadly gases, and, what is more deadly still, heat so great it has burned out much of the oxygen. The outer ring is an updraft, sometimes reaching the edge of the atmosphere. Some fire whirls, not all of them, are flamethrowers. Some pick up burning cones and branches. Some of the giants pick up burning logs and toss them ahead, starting spot fires sometimes a long way ahead. When these spot fires unite, firefighters can be trapped between two fires, as Jansen was soon to be. A crown fire, as we know, is racing if it advances a mile an hour, but a fire whirl can go almost as fast as the wind. Although Jansen thought he had put out of mind the possibility that the jumpers or anything human besides himself could be in Man Gulch, he began to hear metallic noises that sounded like men working. That's the sound of flames heard by those alive after the flames go by. It is the thinking of those living who think they can hear dead men still at work. Even with the flames closing in, Jansen had to follow the sounds in his head, another eighth of a mile up Gulch, till any possibility that men were working in Man Gulch had been obliterated. While he walked that eighth of a mile, the crown fire on the north-facing slope behind him had burned to the bottom of the gulch, and the spot fires that had jumped to the opposite slope had converged behind him into one fire coming up Gulch at him. This fire front on the south-facing slope was in a few minutes to become the blaze only 75 yards behind the Smokejumpers after they dumped their heavy tools to run faster. And the crown fire which Jansen saw moving into the bottom of the gulch was to become the roar the Smokejumpers heard below them at almost the same time. At almost the same time, everything was closing in on them and Jansen. At 5:30, Jansen turned back and started to get out of there quick, but still walking. Then the fire began to whirl continuously. When a streamer from it swept by, he realized after a couple of whiffs that the whirl could cook out his lungs. He began to run. Now he says the whirl was practically upright. My position was in the vortex, which was rapidly narrowing. I held my breath as I crossed the wall. There was no flame, just superheated air and gases and a lot of reflected heat from the ground fire. I conked out from a lack of oxygen, fell on my left elbow, causing a bursitis, which later caused my arm to swell. When he came to, the black creep of the fire was only a few feet behind him. He had fallen victim for a few seconds to the two major enemies that threatened fighters of big fires: toxic gases, especially carbon monoxide, and lack of oxygen from overexertion and from hot air burning out the oxygen. When he finally reached the boat at 5:41, he placed himself in the bow next to Mr. Padbury and watched the whirl for a few minutes. He thought again about the sound of the men working that he imagined he had heard, and again put it out of his mind. Then he smelled his own vomit, apologized to Mrs. Padbury, and moved off to the side. At the Board of Review, he was asked this question, to which he gave a short answer. Gustafson, and looking back up Man Gulch Draw, what was the picture? As to the fire at that time, Jansen, a blow-up. Before the Padbury boat reached Meriwether Landing, Superintendent Moore was in mid-river in a speedboat, preparing to go downstream. When the two boats met, Jansen transferred to the speedboat, and they landed where they could, climbed to an observation point, giving them a complete view of Man Gulch. Jansen says at that time it was apparent that all of Man Gulch had burned out, but it appeared that the big blow-up in Man Gulch was over. At that time, can only be estimated, it was shortly after 6 o'clock. When all is said and done, we still accept the hands of Jim Harrison's watch, which were melted permanently at about 4 minutes to 6, as marking approximately the time that the fire was catching up to the crew. About 20 minutes had passed between the time that Jansen left the mouth of Man Gulch and the time he turned to view the whole of it. Near at hand, trees still exploded from the heat of their own resin. At a distance, vast sounds were being converted into silent lights, and the lights were being turned off, and nowhere were there any longer noises as of men working. For a time, the Man Gulch fire was to become extinct in the minds of the world outside Man Gulch. Jansen and Moore returned upriver to the Meriwether camp, planning the next day. The newly discovered York fire took on an even greater importance after Jansen heard someone on the York fire radio calling frantically for additional help. When Jansen was able to get through on the radio to ascertain the facts, the assistant supervisor, Favre Eaton, was sent from Meriwether to take charge of the York fire. Too many fires were going in too many directions for anyone to think of the Smokejumpers. Jansen says that during the three-way conference between Moore, Eaton, and myself at Meriwether, I am positive that there was nothing said about the Smokejumpers. For some time, the Smokejumpers even passed out of existence on radio, no one noticing that their whereabouts were unknown, everyone assuming the Smokejumpers were infallible firefighters and were taking care of themselves wherever they were. For some time after Eaton left for the York fire and the superintendent with him, Jansen's main concern was why his crew of drunks hadn't returned from the cliffs before it got dark and they fell off.